from Eclectic Paperie, and I'm here today to demonstrate an embossing paste technique. This is coloring embossing paste after it has dried, and I'm using a stencil, some Wendy Vecchi embossing paste, and some Distress inks. So this is my finished card, and I am going to show you how I made this. Quick and easy. So I'm starting with specialty stamp paper, and the reason that I'm going to want to use this is because of the coating that's on the paper. Because I'm going to be doing a Wendy Vecchi technique using archival inks and alcohol blending solution. Now Wendy has demonstrated this at CHA, and she also demonstrates this at her classes using re-inkers, archival ink re-inkers. I don't have any re-inkers in my stash, but I do have the pads, and she also uses just rubbing alcohol, which is a more cost-effective solution than the alcohol blending solution, but I found that this works okay too. So I'm going to show you how to do that technique, which just creates a soft background color on your card or journal page. So I'm starting with a 4-inch by 5 1/4 piece of specialty stamp paper, and cornflower blue and watering can archival inks, and these are from Wendy's archival ink collection. And I have a nonstick craft sheet here. So I'm just going to put down some color from the ink pad, not as much of the watering can because I don't want that darker color to overpower my blue. And then I'm using a little bit of gold metallic refill from a Sukaniko refill that I have had in my stash forever. And you can see I'm using a very teeny tiny amount. The metallic inks go very far, so you don't need much. And then I'm going to use my alcohol blending solution and just put some of that down here across both of these colors and even on the metallic. And I'm going to use a palette knife to mix that alcohol blending solution together with the color. I am going to keep the colors separate. I'll bring some of that metallic in, but I don't want to cross over too much the blue and the gray colors. And then I'm going to swipe my piece of cardstock right through. And of course I like to get some good texture there. One of the fun things about this is that you can apply some more rubbing alcohol or blending solution once the ink is on your card, and it really creates some fun little textures and dots and makes everything kind of swirl around, which I really like. So once you're happy with your piece, you're going to set that aside and let that dry, which will happen fairly quickly. The alcohol inks dry quickly on the coated cardstock. If you're using Distress ink, you're going to need to heat set on this kind of cardstock, and be very careful until it's completely dry because it is a gloss, and because of the properties of the Distress ink, it's not going to immediately dry on top of this coated paper. So this is almost dry. I'm going to hit it with the heat tool just to finish it off. It'll just take a second to dry there. And the metallic tends to kind of go around the edges of where you make puddles, and it really leaves this very subtle bit of shimmer. It's really pretty. I love it when it's dried. And this is just a great way to add any kind of background color. Sometimes I have a hard time with too much white. I'm trying to get over that problem. The first step is admitting I have one. So there we go. We got that great card. Ooh, I don't know which side I like up. I think I like this side up better. So now that I have that, I'm going to add just a little bit of design to the background with using a stencil. And I'm using the Add a Stencil from Wendy Vecchi. Excuse the mess. I've been making a few cards, as you can tell. So I'm just going to lay that down over the top. I am using the mini ink blending tool, which is a great tool for stencils. I like it more than the regular blending tool. And I use the Potting Soil Archival ink. And again, I'm just adding a little bit here in the background. This is not, I don't want full coverage on anything. I don't mind if I have some areas that are light, some that are dark. The reason I'm moving my stencil down off the edge is I like to have the design go off the edge. Instead of creating a border, I don't want to do that. I want that design to kind of continue off the edge. And so now you have just a little bit of design there, which I love. And I love this Add a Stencil because it's these teeny tiny little crosses there, and it's a small design. It looks really nice. So now I'm going to add the embossing paste. for this, I'm using the Vintage Floral Stencil. I'm going to place that down. I'm actually going to line up the edge here because that's the placement where I want my flower, and this will keep things straight. I'm not using the birds from this stencil. And I'm going to pick up some paste with the back of my palette knife. I don't mind the color that is on my stencil a little bit. This was from using Archival Inks. Archival Inks does not, it actually stains any kind of plastic or anything. So there's no color that's coming off of the stencil onto the card. That's just a stained Archival ink. Of course, if you use Distress ink, that will come right off of the stencil, but the Archival ink tends to stain just like it would on a stamp. Okay? So you can see that that's pure white there. Very pretty. I'm going to put that aside to dry and clean off my stencil. You always want to make sure that you clean your stencil off of all embossing paste because it does dry very hard and off one's hands. So you can see when you clean all that up, you do have a lot of paste left, so it's a good idea to put that back in your jar, and that helps prevent any waste. And then you'll want to use a baby wipe or a wet towel, something just to get the rest of that paste off and make sure that's all clean. And you can see here how this is Archival inks will stain a little bit. If you want that to come completely off, as you can tell, I don't mind dirty stencils too much. But if you want it completely clean, you can use rubbing alcohol to remove that Archival ink. We'll make that come right off. All right. So embossing paste dries fairly quickly. You can hit it with a heat gun. Just make sure you keep the heat gun moving. But we're not going to wait for that. I actually have a sample already created. So here you go. This is dry. And I'll show you a little bit more about the design on top after we color the ink. So this is completely dry. And I'm going to take my stencil and put it right back over that dried embossing paste. And because the embossing paste comes up off of the, is raised off of the card, it's actually very easy to line the stencil back up, and the stencil stays put, doesn't slide around too much. And some of my little edges are coming up there. So I am going to be using crushed olive and ripe persimmon distress ink, and then I'll show you how you can do some shading with the, let me start with crushed olive. How you can do some shading with the Archival inks as well. Now I have this is a pretty intricate design, and so it would be difficult, even with the mini ink blending tool, to get in here without having my color run all over. So I'll show you how I work around that. But for these larger leaves, it's okay if I'm just going to kind of use the edge here of my blending tool, and you can see it doesn't take any effort to add color to the embossing paste. It takes the color beautifully, just with one application. So I have these Fantastics, which is a coloring tool brush. It really is almost like a Q-tip that's a little bit more condensed, a little more packed. You could also use a Q-tip for this. You could do that for real, but I do like the slight point. So to get into the stems here, because I've got these very thin stems and these little teeny flowers, and by using a Q-tip or one of these little blending tools, I can even create small little stems on these little clusters of flowers. So I'm going to color in there. Let's see, we can even come down here and do this a little bit. And because Distress ink stays wet for a little bit of time, it doesn't dry very quickly like an Archival ink would, you have some time to move that color around, and you could wait a few minutes for it to dry and come back in. Okay, so that's all my green. And now if I wanted to come in with the Archival, this is fern green, I can come in here and add a little bit of this darker color here to the bottom of my leaves if I wanted a little bit more shading, a little bit darker area. And of course you might have to pick up the Archival ink a few more times because it doesn't, it's permanent when it goes down, so it's going to dry very quickly. So you might have to go back a few times. Okay, So now we'll go ahead and use the right persimmon. Let me change my little foam on my blending tool here. And of course for this one, because it's a larger space, I can really go right in and color. And I'll just be careful around the edges because I don't want to run over all my green. This one I really got to be very gentle with, and I think I still went over there a little bit. Can cover that up, no problem. Okay, and you can see one application of the Distress ink works beautifully on the embossing paste. And then I'm going to go back now. Actually, I'll do a little bit of this too. I'm again using so I'm going to continue using the stick to color in these little tiny buds. I think I got them all. Okay. And then I can come back in like I did with the leaves. And use, this is orange blossom. Use some of that orange blossom and the stick around the edge here to give just a little bit of definition there. And again, that'll, because the Distress ink stays wet a little bit, you can blend those two together quite nicely without really any problem. All right, great. I think I have everything down. Everything covered. And then if we take our stencil off, voila! Beautiful color added to the dry embossing paste. So, and you can color embossing paste with paint doing the same technique. You could put the embossing paste down and then put the paint over it, or you can mix the embossing paste before you put it down and create custom colors, and then of course use Wendy's mix and store jars to store your custom colors. Okay, so that is colored. I wanted to also show you my finished card. I created this border across the top, and that was real easy. I actually used a portion of a stamp. It says Secret File, and that is from Wendy's Approved Art stamp set. So it's this stamp, and I really like this little design here. So I'll show you back on this other sample how I did that. I used a grid block to line up on the very first grid, line up. There's a line here in part of this design. So I put the line right against that very first block on the grid. And then I'm just going to use my black archival. I don't need to mask this because there's enough space between the letters, and I can just very easily ink up just that bottom portion. And I won't do all of this, but when I come over here to my card, if I line up this first line with the edge of my card, and make sure I do it on both sides, I can then stamp down that design right where I want that to go. And I did that on my finished card all the way across the top. I just ran that across a few times. So the other element that I added to my final card was a frame, and Wendy puts frames around a lot of her flowers and items that she creates, these focal points that she creates on her journals and her cards. And while this looks great as it is, it really needs to be grounded. It's floating a little bit. It's not resting on anything, and that's where the frame really comes in handy. So I'm using an oval Spellbinders die. You could use anything that's round. I've used a plate before. I think Wendy's used plates before. You can use, the bottom of jars and caps. You can use all kinds of things just to get the shape that you want. And I'm just going to place that down. And I'm using a football marker. These are great markers. They work really well on top of any kind of painted surface. And it has a very smooth little ball where the ink comes out and the ink flows. It's awesome. I love these things. And then I can just trace around the die And of course I'm stopping where I get to anywhere these little pieces that are peeking out. We don't want to run over our embossed image. And the food ball does not dry very quickly on this coated cardstock, so you're going to want to be careful. And once you're finished doing any kind of design, you're going to want to heat set that before you do anything else. So you can just see how that really grounds the whole image and it gives it a place to sit. The other thing I did on my finished card was kind of add in some little polka dots all the way around. And again, because the ink flows so freely from the food ball pen, you can just keep going all the way around to do that. Okay? And anytime you're using this pen on something that's glossy, this won't be the case if you're using it on a matte paper or anything where it would soak in. But because the coating is on the specialty stamp paper, we're going to want to dry that a little bit. And the last element that I added to my, or it wasn't the, yeah, I guess the last element I added before I put my sentiment on, was to add kind of this area here that needed something. And so the little bits, don't mind this, it's really a mess. The little bits stencil has this little tiny heart. And I thought I'd really like that heart down here on the side. And I'll show you how I connect that to the top, so again the heart is not just floating. So I'm using some red geranium archival ink, and hopefully, yes, I'm not finding any of my red mini ink blending tool, so we're going to use the opposite side from that orange that I used. And this is where the mini ink blending tool really comes in handy too, because I've got this tiny little stencil that I'm trying to color in here, and I don't want that ink, of course, going anywhere else. So I'm going to color that in, which doesn't take very long. And then I'm going to use the Vintage Mesh background stamp, also from Wendy Vecchi. A little tiny bit of that black archival. And not too much of this shows up in this little heart, but we're going to go for it anyway. And you get just that little bit of design in the heart. And then to connect it to the top, real simple. Just going to draw a straight line straight up to that little border. And then you can even add, on my original one, I added a few dots just because, almost like if it's knots in a string, because it, I don't know, seemed like a long line without anything else going on there. Okay? So here is my finished card. I used the Believe stamp from the license plate art stamp set. I'll show you that one. And I just stamped and embossed that on a piece of scrap paper, cut it out, used a little Distress ink around the edges and gathered twigs, and I added a little pearl to the center of the flower. So that's a great way for you to add color to embossing paste. The embossing paste takes color great, whether it's Distress inks or archival inks. Probably any ink pad that you would use, you wouldn't have a problem on the embossing paste. So I hope you enjoyed today's video, and you'll give coloring embossing paste a try sometime soon. Take care.